and Muslim, begun at the close of the 11th century and fought for 200 years. At stake, a tiny strip of land just a few hundred miles long, but with the greatest prize, Jerusalem. Now this holy war has passed into legend. But there were those who saw it with their own eyes. Great chroniclers from two different worlds, Christian and Muslim, who wrote of great deeds, great battles, great warriors, of men who would lay down their lives for their God. This was the collision of two great faiths, the clash between the Crescent and the Cross. This was the Crusades. Of all the cities in the world, Jerusalem has the most troubled past and the most troubling future. To the Jews, it is the site of the great temples of Herod and Solomon. To Muslims, the place where Muhammad ascended to heaven. To Christians, the place where their Messiah was crucified. After his death, the word of Jesus Christ took root, and Jerusalem slowly shed almost 4 centuries of Roman occupation to embrace Christian rule. But in the 7th century, the holy city was forcibly seized by a new faith, Islam. Now, 400 years later, the Christians wanted Jerusalem back. Across Europe, some 60,000 warriors were gathering, readying themselves for battle. One of the leaders was veteran warlord Duke Godfrey of Bouillon. He would head up his own army on what would become a 3-year crusade across 3,000 miles to reclaim Jerusalem in the name of God. Godfrey was more than just an acclaimed fighter. A generous benefactor of the Catholic Church, he was also an immensely pious man.
As far as I'm concerned, there's one key thing that's driving people to take up the cross, and that is that they actually believe that this crusade is a spiritual war and that it's going to purify their souls of sin. And yes, I'm sure they've got other agendas, they've got other things they're looking for at the same time, but if there's one thing that's at the core and that it's across the largest range of people, it's spirituality, it's religion that's driving this.
The Franks, which was the catch-all word for everyone who participated in the Crusades, were regarded for many centuries until this day as barbarians who came to destroy the peak of Islamic civilization. And this is a very strong thing which goes down right to this day. So the word crusade is electric, and people know it. They know what happened in that world.
There was good reason why men would risk everything to journey to a distant land from which they might never return. Blighted by famine and racked by petty wars, their European homeland was a cursed place. They craved a better life in this world and the next.
I think if you were to take a time machine back to the late 11th century, the first thing that would probably strike you is what a violent society it was. We're at a time when sort of central government's not very well organised, the great monarchies of France and Spain haven't developed. It's petty lordships, local castellans, they raid, they fight, they scrap one another. It's a time of endemic lawlessness.
One of the most learned men in Christendom, painted a disturbing portrait of this chaotic world. A senior archbishop and a consort of kings, William of Tyre wrote the history of the Crusades as he saw it.
In nearly all the circle of the earth, belief had failed. The fear of the Lord no longer prevailed among men. Justice had perished from the world. Violence held sway among the nations. Fraud, treachery, and chicanery overshadowed all things. All virtue had departed and ceased to exist as useless. Evil reigned in its stead.
There was only one organization with the potential to stem this anarchy: the Church. The Catholic faith dominated 11th century Western Europe.
The world of the Middle Ages was a world that was deeply concerned with matters of religion, and it's almost impossible for us in a secular age today to overestimate how concerned they were. It's almost impossible for us to understand how concerned they were.
People are bombarded with the fact that they are threatened by sin from all forms of life. Just about everything they can do in life is potentially sinful. It's literally as if the air they're breathing is contaminated with a sin.
The Church could absolve a man of his sins, but it lacked the political muscle to wash away the ills of an entire society. Feuds with the secular rulers of Europe had pushed the papacy to the sidelines until 1088, when a new pope arrived in Rome, Pope Urban II.
Pope Urban was an astute individual, a man who understood the political and social and religious currents and needs of his time, someone who knew how to bring those things together and channel them into productive outlets.
Pope Urban needed a master plan to put the Catholic Church back on the political map. The answer to his prayers would come in the form of a desperate plea for help from an old rival. In 1095, a desperate call for help was dispatched to the head of the Catholic Church, Pope Urban II. Sent from the imperial court of Constantinople, it came from his Eastern Christian rival, the political master of the Greek Orthodox Church, the Byzantine Emperor Alexius I. The power of Alexius's empire was slipping. The influence of his Orthodox Church had once stretched as far as the Holy Land of the Middle East. Islam was now the dominant force in the region. The Seljuk Turks were recent converts to Islam. They had emerged from the steppes of Central Asia and swept down into the Middle East in search of land. Fearsome warriors. Their armies numbered tens of thousands. They seized control of the Muslim territories of Persia, Syria, and Palestine, and finally captured the holy city of Jerusalem. Then they turned their gaze north and stormed their way to the doorstep of the great Byzantine capital, Constantinople.
The status quo, the existing power politics, the power balance of the region was changed. The Byzantines had lost a great area of taxation, of recruitment for troops. They'd lost a lot of prestige as well.
By 1095, the Emperor Alexius was desperate to strike back. But he couldn't do it alone. He appealed to the Pope, in the spirit of Christian brotherhood, to send an elite force of knights to help him keep the Turks at bay. It presented Pope Urban with a perfect opportunity to enhance his political power.
You've got to understand that the popes of that period were politicians. much more so than they are now. Even now, the current Pope intervenes in politics all the time. But at that time, the popes were big players, scheming, manipulating, intriguing, politicking. They were basically the politicians of the church.
Pope Urban was set to hijack the misfortune of the Byzantine Empire. He would launch his own holy war against Islam. A crusade that would strengthen his papacy and put Rome back at the center of the world political stage.
The idea of the Crusade satisfies a number of particular agendas for the Pope. It allows him to increase his authority over the knighthood of Western Europe at the expense of other secular rulers. It directs the violent knights away from their practices of brutalizing the church in the West. It also rolls back the infidel. It begins to allow the Christians to reclaim the holy places.
In November 1095, the Pope performed a spellbinding open-air sermon outside the town of Clermont in France. It was a rallying call to princes, knights, clerics, and the common man to wage a war under the banner of the Catholic Church.
Urban must have been a remarkably charismatic and effective speaker. Being at his speech must have been like being at some kind of mass rally, a Billy Graham crusade, a pop concert, something like elements of all of those things together. There were thousands and thousands of people there.
His sermon was a cunningly crafted piece of religious spin, spiced with exaggerated tales of Muslim atrocities against Christian pilgrims living in the Holy Land. It demonized the Turks and presented the crusade as the apocalyptic war of two faiths.
His words seemed to proceed from God and were received by young and old alike eagerly as a command from on high. The cradle of our faith, the native land of our Lord and the mother of salvation, is now forcibly held by a people without God. For many years now, the wicked race of Saracens, followers of unclean practices, have oppressed with tyrannical violence the holy places where the feet of our Lord rested. Dogs have entered into the holy places. Priests have been slain in the sanctuaries, virgins forced to choose between prostitution and death by torture.
The emotional intensity of the moment was very high, and when the end of the speech was reached, Urban gave an appeal, and people came forward from the crowd to take the cross, literally to take strips of cloth and put them on their clothing, over their breast, over their heart perhaps, and to indicate that they were taking vows and were going to go to the east to rescue their brothers.
Inspired by the possibility of great prestige and honor, tens of thousands of men and women, families, even whole villages took vows to join Pope Urban's crusade. But for many, like the young knight who wrote an eyewitness account of his journey to Jerusalem, there was another. The clash between the Crescent and the Cross. This was the Crusades. And Muslim, begun at the close of the 11th century and fought for 200 years. At stake, a tiny strip of land just a few hundred miles long, but with the greatest prize, Jerusalem. Now this holy war has passed into legend. But there were those who saw it with their own eyes. Great chroniclers from two different worlds. Of all the cities in the world, Jerusalem has the most Christian and Muslim who wrote of great deeds, great battles, great warriors, of men who would lay down their lives for their God. This was the collision of two great faiths,